In a way, I mean, we're speaking here in such somber tones about these stories and about what they convey to us. Most of Edgar's stories are very funny. I mean, you read some of them and you even laugh out loud, and even if you don't laugh out loud, there's a kind of undercurrent of humor there. And so, just to put things in proportion, despite all of this angst and the desensitization and all these very somber themes, I think the overriding effect is one of light and humorous stories. So there's this constant oxymoron, in a way.
Well, partly because they're short, and I think he uses this humor of compression, where things that are fairly absurd collide, and then you just have to shrug, and say, okay, there's a story that is both funny and brutal, called No Politics, where these guys are sitting around a cafe, and the owner, a Romanian, has this rule: no politics can be discussed in the cafe. And there's this bald-headed guy, and he keeps bringing up politics, and everybody gets very nervous, and finally the bald-headed guy, who will not pick up on any of these messages, starts saying something nasty about David Ben-Gurion.
Calling him a midget. Yeah.
The midget, and the Romanian owner basically leaps for his throat and rips him apart, cannibalizes him, or whatever,
Yeah.
And the other, clients say, "Gee, we haven't seen a Romanian get so worked up in a long time," But it's a kind of typical Edgar Keret move, in that he takes something that is very, very common, at family gatherings. Let's not talk about politics. Let's not get into that, But then he takes that thing, which is, oh, they're going to start arguing about politics, and he just takes it to a whole other level. Well, what would happen if people really, acted out of their id, acted out of their impulse, and so we see what happens.
Very typically, it's a story about a murder at which we laugh at the end, right?
Yes.
So it's that juxtaposition again.
Yes. I think that something that struck me again and again is how often in these stories happiness and sadness are directly addressed as themes. That is, he writes about being. He names happiness. He names sadness a lot, and the last story in this collection, the Summer of '76. The young man is talking to his grandfather, and he says, but Grandpa wouldn't let it go. He'd pinch my ear and whisper that if you want to know how to enjoy life, you also have to know what sadness is. Otherwise, it isn't worth a damn. I tried, but life was so beautiful then, that summer of '76, that no matter how hard I worked at it, I couldn't be sad about anything. And there's another story in which, called Happy Birthday to You, where nothing bad can happen to this person because it's her birthday,
I love that story.
Yeah, yeah.
There's nothing sad in that story, nothing complicated in that story. It's just, everything's perfect.
Except, don't you think that because of that, the comedy is how implausible that would be?
Of course. There is something sad underneath it, but
yeah.
Yes. But I mean, just as a kind of completion of the idea that you quoted, in the story called The Real Winner of the Preliminary Games, the guy gets home after a very tense...
He thinks of killing himself.
And then he says, but maybe in the general scheme of things, he couldn't find any meaning to life, but on a smaller scale it was okay. So between sadness and happiness, he takes this down to, it's always also this contrast between the larger scheme of things and our little daily lives.
Yes.
Right? I look at it, as I said, through the spectacles of a translator.
Yes.
And there's one thing that I always wonder about whenever I'm translating, and I speak here also for my colleague and friend Sandra Silverstone, who translated almost half of the story, so I'm representing her here as well. We always wonder, what will the audience abroad get out of this? Or can we use this word, will they understand it? Can we refer to this concept, or will it be bizarre to them? And this is a constant quandary. So for me, being here, apart from the fact that I'm delighted to be here, and this is a rare opportunity for me, will give me an opportunity when we speak with people who are seated here to find out whether our gamble or our speculation is on target or off target. Let me give you just an example or two. He has a story which doesn't appear in this collection about my orange shirt. And it's all about the fact that he has only one decent shirt, and it happens to be orange. But the story takes place during the disengagement. And if I stopped there, I don't know how many people here who are not Israelis will know why that becomes already a problem. But the disengagement from Gaza, the people who were against it, orange was their symbol. And if you wore orange, or you had an orange bag, or an orange ribbon, or an orange anything, that meant that you were pro-Likud, anti-disengagement, more or less. And poor Etgar Keret, the only decent shirt he had was orange. And he has this argument with his wife, who says, you can't dare wear an orange shirt. And he walks down the street in an orange shirt, and people immediately assume that he's a right-wing fanatic, and they attack him, and so on and so forth. Now, if we just leave it at orange shirt, I mean, what's the problem with orange shirt? That's an easy phrase to understand, but the associations that go with it have to be explained. But if you start explaining, it's like explaining a joke, and the whole thing gets lost. And there are constant examples. This goes on all the time with his stories. So the very fact that they seem to be understood by people here means either that the people here are much cleverer than we assume, or know a lot more about Israel, or else that maybe it's universal.
I think it's something in between universal and the kind of forbearingness with which we read all foreign literature. If I'm reading a Japanese novel, I know I'm not going to get all the references, but I'm going to get the general idea. And if I read a Russian novel, I read, when I was a teenager, I read almost all Russian literature, and I had never laid eyes on a samovar, and I didn't really know what a troika looked like, but I just said, okay, troika is something that moves, and a samovar is something you get tea from, and that's enough for me, So you kind of skip over what you don't know and keep going for what you do know. And part of the pleasure, I think, in reading literature from elsewhere is that there is this kind of like recognition, but foreignness,
Yeah.
And of course, Keret uses, sprinkles, David Lynch, let's say, or Bob Dylan or stuff like that. Goes into the. He uses all these references and movies and books and everything like that. But you don't translate with this other translator. You just divide up the stories.
Well, yes and no. We divide up the stories, but then we each go over each other's translations and discuss things. And then we meet with Etgar and we go over it again. Then we send it to the editor in New York and get feedback and go over it again. And then we meet again. In short, we agonize throughout the entire process, and we do definitely collaborate.
Mm-hmm. And Edgar speaks very good English because I gave a reading with him, and I know
Yes.
His English is...
He speaks good English, but because he's very unassuming and extremely nice, what often happens is he'll see something in the translation, he'll have a sense that it isn't quite what he wanted to say, and then he'll never say, this isn't what I meant. He'll always say something like, look, I could be wrong, and of course I don't know English very well, and of course I trust your judgment, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think perhaps that what I meant here was such and such. So we have this whole self-effacing process and negotiating process, but it works well, I think.
Another thing about his work, I think, is that there's this very mundane level of, the man in the street whose girlfriend has just left him and who's upset by all the traffic. And then there's always this kind of spiritual or transcendent yearning that's pulling at the characters, and in a way they're floating up to the ceiling or sitting on the top of a refrigerator is part of that. So for me, this is where I start to feel Kafka, because of this widening gap between the intention and the reality, and he has said in this interview that he's not very religious, but his work is always sort of like pointing to something beyond.
Perhaps. Well, one of my favorite stories, I have it here somewhere, is called The Bus Driver Who Wanted to Be God. So if that isn't pointing to something beyond, I don't know what is. And it's exactly this idea of something very transcendent and something very, very mundane, because this guy is desperate to get to a date with a certain girl that he wants to see. So he must be God in order to get there.